I've always been the kind of person who attracts the unexplainable, even though my family is full of hardcore skeptics who don't believe in anything they can't see. When I was about 19, I went to stay at my aunt's place for a long weekend while she was hosting a massive anniversary party for some of her friends. Her house was this massive, drafty estate tucked away in a deep, wooded valley far from any city lights, and it was built sometime in the mid-1800s. It was the kind of place that always felt like it was breathing, with floorboards that groaned under their own weight and rooms that stayed cold even in the summer. I wasn't really looking for trouble or expecting anything creepy because the house was packed with people, including my younger cousins who were constantly running around the halls. But looking back, I realized that having so many people around actually made it easier to ignore the things that shouldn't have been there at all. The room she gave me was tucked away on the 3rd floor, at the very end of a long, narrow hallway that seemed to stretch on forever when the lights were out. It had a strange layout because of the way the house had been renovated over the years, including a weird interior door that led directly onto a small, dusty balcony. This balcony overlooked the grand library below, but the door was stuck halfway open, leaving a gap just wide enough for someone to peek through or even squeeze inside. My bed was positioned right across from that opening, so every time I looked up, I was staring directly into the dark, hollow space of the library. It didn't bother me much during the day when the sun was out, but as the sun dipped behind the trees, the gap started to look like a black eye. I tried to shut it, but the wood had swollen so much over the decades that it wouldn't budge an inch, so I just decided to ignore it. I eventually fell into a heavy sleep after the first night of the party, but something jolted me awake right around 3:30 in the morning when the house was silent. My blankets had somehow slid halfway off the bed and were pooled on the cold floor, leaving me shivering in the damp air that seemed to cling to the walls. I tried to pull them back up and settle into the pillow, but my mind was suddenly racing, and the heavy silence of the rural countryside made every little sound feel amplified. I laid there for a while, just staring at the ceiling and watching the faint shadows cast by the moon as they shifted slowly across the peeling wallpaper of my room. The only source of light was a dim security lamp from the driveway that filtered through the high windows, casting long, distorted shapes across the floor and the furniture. I must have been lying there for nearly an hour, just drifting in that weird space between being awake and dreaming, not really focusing on anything specific. The silence in that house was different from the silence in my own home because it felt heavy, like the air itself was thick with years of unspoken history and hidden secrets. I kept thinking about how the house was built in the mid-1800s, and how many people must have lived and died within these very walls before I was even born. I tried to close my eyes and force myself back to sleep, but every time I drifted off, I felt a strange prickling sensation on the back of my neck. It felt like I was being watched by something that wasn't quite there, a feeling that grew more intense with every passing minute as the clock ticked toward dawn. I shifted my position to face the interior balcony door, thinking that maybe a draft was causing the hair on my arms to stand up, but the air was still. That was when my eyes finally landed on the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to be coalescing into a shape that didn't belong there. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, or maybe a pile of clothes I had tossed onto a chair earlier that evening, so I didn't think much of it. But as my eyes adjusted to the low light, I realized the figure was far too small and defined to be a shadow, and it wasn't moving an inch. It was a young boy, maybe 7 years old, standing perfectly still right in front of the opening that led out toward the dark, empty library. He was wearing what looked like an old-fashioned nightshirt that was several sizes too big, and his skin had a translucent, sickly pale quality that made him look ill. He wasn't looking at the door or the hallway. He was staring directly at me with wide, unblinking eyes that seemed to be reflecting the faint light from outside. It was one of those moments where your heart just stops, and for a second, you forget how to breathe because the reality of the situation is too much. The most unsettling thing about him wasn't just his presence, but the expression on his face, which looked like he was witnessing something absolutely horrific right behind my shoulder. His mouth was hanging open in a silent gasp, and his small hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides as if he were trying to keep himself from screaming. I felt a wave of pure, icy dread wash over me as I realized he looked completely terrified, almost like he was frozen in a moment of absolute life-altering panic. Without thinking, I lunged across the bed, scrambling toward the heavy wooden door of my bedroom and slamming it shut with a loud bang that echoed through the house. I fumbled for the light switch until the room was flooded with a bright, comforting yellow glow, and I immediately grabbed my phone from the nightstand to check for messages. I started scrolling through my social media feeds just to see if any of my friends back home were still awake. hoping that their digital presence would drown out the fear. I sat there for what felt like hours, the blue light of my phone screen being the only thing keeping me grounded while the rest of the house remained silent. Every tiny creak of the old wood made me jump, and I couldn't stop my eyes from darting back toward that stuck balcony door. Even though the room was lit, I tried to tell myself that it was just a trick of the light or some weird waking dream brought on by the exhaustion of the party preparations. But the memory of that kid's pale, frozen face was burned into my mind, and no matter how much I scrolled, I couldn't shake the feeling of his terror. It wasn't just that he was a ghost, it was the way he looked like he was watching something horrific happen right in front of him in that room. I eventually worked up the courage to get off the bed, my legs feeling like lead, and I moved toward the window to see if anyone else was awake. Looking out into the yard, I could see the tall trees swaying in the wind, their branches scratching against the side of the house like skeletal fingers trying to get in. There was no one moving outside, and the security light finally flickered and died, plunging the world beyond my window into a deep, suffocating blanket of midnight blue. I turned back toward the hallway door, wondering if I should run down to my aunt's room, but the thought of walking through those dark corridors alone was worse. Suddenly, I heard a faint, rhythmic thumping coming from the other side of the stuck balcony door, a sound that seemed to be vibrating through the floorboards under my feet. It wasn't the sound of footsteps, but rather something soft and heavy being dragged across the library carpet, followed by a sharp, metallic clicking sound like a lock turning. I froze in place, holding my breath so tightly that my chest began to ache, listening as the dragging sound moved closer to the gap in the heavy wood. The dragging stopped right outside the opening, and for a moment, the only thing I could hear was the frantic pounding of my own heart against my ribs. I found myself staring at the gap, terrified that whatever the little boy had been looking at was now standing on the other side of that interior door. I didn't want to look, but my curiosity was like a magnet, pulling my gaze toward the dark sliver of space that led out over the library's vast, empty drop. I crept closer, my phone flashlight trembling in my hand, until I could see a small, pale hand reaching through the gap and gripping the edge of the doorframe. It wasn't the boy's hand. This one was long, thin, and covered in a layer of gray dust that made the skin look like cracked parchment in the light. I watched in horror as the fingers tightened, their yellowed nails digging deep into the soft wood of the frame as if something was trying to pull itself into my room. I backed away so fast that I tripped over my own suitcase, crashing onto the floor with a loud thud that seemed to echo through every single corner of the estate. The hand vanished instantly, retracting back into the darkness of the library, as if it had never been there at all, leaving only the deep gouges in the wood. I scrambled to my feet, my mind screaming at me to get out of that room. But the hallway outside felt even more predatory than the space I was currently in. I realized then that the little boy hadn't been looking at me with fear, but rather he had been staring at the space directly behind the door I was guarding. He was a warning, a lingering echo of a moment where something much worse had caught up to him in this very room over 100 years ago. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead as the temperature in the room dropped significantly. I didn't wait for a third sign. I grabbed my car keys from the nightstand and threw on my shoes, deciding that sleeping in my car was infinitely better than staying. I yanked my bedroom door open and sprinted down the long hallway, my flashlight beam dancing wildly against the portraits of long-dead relatives that lined the dark, narrow walls. As I passed the entrance to the library, I couldn't help but glance over the railing, and for a split second, I saw the little boy again, standing at the bottom. He wasn't looking at me this time. He was pointing up toward the balcony outside my room, his face twisted in a silent, desperate plea for me to keep moving. High above him, a tall, dark shadow was leaning over the balcony railing, its long, spindly limbs draped over the edge like the legs of a giant, predatory insect. I didn't look back after that, flying down the stairs and bursting out through the heavy front doors into the cool, crisp air of the wooded valley. I spent the rest of the night parked a few miles away at a brightly lit gas station, watching the sun slowly climb over the horizon while I nursed a coffee. When I went back the next morning to get my things, the house looked perfectly normal in the daylight, filled with the smells of breakfast and the sounds of laughter. My aunt asked why I had left so early, and I just made up some excuse about a sudden work emergency, not wanting to sound like a lunatic to her. As I packed my bags, I glanced at the interior door and saw the deep, fresh gouges in the wood where those dusty fingers had gripped the frame. I didn't say a word to anyone, but as I drove away from that valley, I knew I was never coming back to that house, no matter the occasion. Even now, whenever I stay in an old building, I find myself checking the doors and windows for gaps, terrified of seeing that pale, frozen face again. My name is Ronald. I grew up in a part of mountains where the trees grow so thick you can barely see the sky. Our house was a sprawling old place made of dark wood and stone. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy on your ears, especially when the sun goes down and the shadows start stretching across the lawn. I remember one specific autumn evening when my parents had gone into the nearest town for dinner, leaving me in charge of my younger brother. We were sitting in the den with a bowl of popcorn, trying to focus on a movie while the wind rattled the window panes. The heater was humming a low tune that usually made me feel safe, but that night it felt like the house was trying to cover up a different sound. My brother stood up to go get a glass of water from the kitchen, but he stopped dead in his tracks before he even reached the doorway. He didn't say a word, but the way his shoulders tensed up made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end immediately. I asked him what was wrong as I joined him in the hall, and he just pointed toward the large bay window that looked out over the back acreage. He told me that he had seen a tall, dark shape leaning against the old oak tree, just standing there as if it were waiting for something. We both stared into the darkness for what felt like hours, watching the way the moon cast long, skeletal shadows across the dying grass. There was nothing there when I finally gathered the courage to flip on the porch light, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. This wasn't the first time that something strange had happened on our property, though I had tried my hardest to bury the memory of the previous summer. I had invited a few guys from school over for a camping trip in the backyard, and we were all jammed into a single tent near the tree line. It was well past midnight when one of my friends nudged me awake, his face pale in the dim glow of his flashlight as he whispered about a noise. He described a rhythmic thudding sound, like someone dragging something heavy through the dry leaves just a few feet away from where we were sleeping. I told him he was just hearing a deer or maybe a stray dog, and I insisted that we all just go back to sleep. I was too embarrassed to admit that I was terrified, so I never mentioned the incident to my mother or father the next morning. Everything changed a few months later during a massive thunderstorm that knocked out the power and left the entire valley drenched in a cold, oppressive gray. My father had to go out to the barn in the middle of the night because he thought one of the shutters had come loose and was banging. He was gone for a long time, and when he finally came back inside, he looked like he had seen something that defied any logical explanation. He didn't yell or panic, but his hands were shaking as he locked the heavy deadbolt and pulled the kitchen curtain shut with a sudden jerk. He described seeing a figure standing near the fence line that looked like a person, but it was far too tall, and its limbs moved with a jerky, mechanical motion. The most unsettling part was that the figure didn't seem to care about the rain or the freezing wind, standing perfectly still in the mud. My father explained that the thing had no face that he could discern, just a smooth surface that reflected the occasional flash of lightning from the clouds above. We live so far out in the wilderness that there is absolutely no reason for a stranger to be wandering onto our land at 3 in the morning. He stayed up for the rest of the night sitting in the kitchen with a flashlight, watching the perimeter through the small gap in the window blinds. I sat on the stairs and listened to the rain, wondering how many times that thing had been out there while we were all sleeping soundly. It made me realize that the stories my friends told and the shadow my brother saw were likely the exact same entity stalking our home. Now I can't even look at the tree line after the sun sets without feeling a cold shiver run down the entire length of my spine. The property feels different now, as if the very air has turned sour, and the trees are leaning just a little bit closer to the roof than they used to. I never go outside after dark anymore, not even to take out the trash or to check the mail, because the fear is just too overwhelming. My parents have started talking about selling the place and moving closer to a town where there are streetlights and neighbors and actual paved roads. It is a heavy burden to carry, knowing that there is something out there in the woods that doesn't belong to our world but wants to be near us. I just hope that we can leave this place behind before whatever is lurking outside decides to finally find a way to come through the front door.